Jono, how are we, sir?
Great to be back, Matt. Great. Fantastic.
Great. Everything's great except Australian politics. What the heck happened
I
there?
knew we were going to start with this topic. It's just great to be back in Australia. That word again. We've resigned ourselves for another 3 years of Labor rule, and what that means for energy policy. So, yeah, there's been a few of us that have been a little bit distraught, but we'll move on.
What happened? I think we're well. I think Western Australia. We said that'll stay Labor. Everything else is going to. The tide will turn. And it's going to be pro-nuclear again. What happened?
It was a poorly run campaign by the Liberal National Conservatives, to be honest. They got outplayed. They got out strategized by Labor. For the first time, though, I mean, let's look at some positives. For the first time in Australian history, the nuclear NIMBY campaign, the Not In My Backyard, the nuclear scare campaign lost. Actually, the Liberals won that. And that's demonstrated by the fact that in and around the electorates where these plants were actually proposed, their vote held up pretty well. So for the first time, nuclear wasn't the scary green devil. The three-eyed fish memes actually failed. But where Labor succeeded is they started attacking cost and saying they came up with this number. Sorry, a renewables industry group in Australia came up with a number, $600 billion. Literally from a renewables industry group. Labor ran with that. And then they overlaid that, say, well, not only is it going to be hideously expensive, but we're going to cut your Medicare, or for UK viewers, your NHS, we're going to cut your Medicare to pay for it. That's what they're going to have to do. And that little double whammy there of stupidly expensive and cutting healthcare, complete lie. But as we all know, there's no requirement to tell the truth in political terms and in campaigning. And it was wildly successful. So you saw what started off as actually a relatively high level of support for nuclear in the policy platform in the election actually just crashed.
So obviously you got 3 years now of the same. I mean, Peter Dutton, he lost his own seat,
He did.
which is embarrassing. So what now for the Liberals? What now for Australian politics going forward?
Well, rebuilding for that side of politics, I guess. There's a new leader, Suzanne Lay. So they're going through that process. They actually had a split up of the coalition, and literally yesterday, I think they've kissed and made up. So there is now a formal coalition once again. The other thing that happened is that the Greens vote in Australia collapsed in the lower house. So you've had Peter Dutton was the leader of the coalition. He lost his seat. The leader of the Greens actually lost his seat as well, a guy called Adam Bant. He had presided over the Greens, I think many people saying moving away from their core, so moving away from core environmental issues towards social unrest and justice and Israel-Palestine commentary and fairness for renters in the property market and all sorts of stuff. And that clearly did not resonate with the electorate, and he lost what was a very safe Greens seat. He lost it to the Labor Party as well. So yeah, a bit of a resetting of the political base, I guess, in Australia.
Right. Well, it'll all level out in the end, and we'll have more of the same again. Thus it always is. What about our dear friend? Well, go on.
And our dear friend Chris Bowen, he's my favourite.
Dear friend, you knew that was coming, right?
Yeah, okay, I know, cool. I did, right? So Mr. Bowen has retained his seat, although he suffered a bit of a swing against him, but retained his seat and has retained the portfolio of energy and climate change minister. So, what we're facing there is he's taken that as a mandate for his energy policy, notwithstanding the fact that Labor won this election with the lowest primary vote they've ever had, 34%. So while they actually, because of our preference system, they got quite a strong majority, their primary vote, so people who actually voted for them, was the weakest on record. But Chris has taken that as a resounding backing of his renewables agenda, and he's doubling down. The other thing is that he's now been mooted to be the next climate czar, given Australia is bidding to host COP31 next year or the year after, whenever it is. They want to host that in Adelaide. So we may be facing the prospect of Chris joining the world stage. So, you guys can enjoy his wonderful knowledge and expertise as well.
he's going to be a bit of an outlier, isn't he, if he's sort of anti-nuclear as a global climate czar? Because you think about the pressure that's being exerted. Well, we'll come to it in a second. I hope we do. Anyway, we'll talk about obviously executive orders and coming out of the US, very, very encouraging, and elsewhere. But what's he? How does he navigate?
Well, it's going to be a fine. That's going to be a fine line, isn't it? To try and tread that path, saying, "Oh, I'm anti-nuclear, but hey, it's okay for the rest of the world." In my view, I think Australia does have a good option in a chap called Peter Malinauskas, who's the Premier of South Australia. Now, South Australia is where they're proposing to run this conference, the COP conference. South Australia also happens to have the highest renewables penetration in Australia, but Malinauskas is also pro-uranium mining and openly, ideologically open to nuclear energy. So I think he'd be a candidate that would much better fit the bill. But we'll end up seeing how that goes. I think it's Turkey that's also bidding to host that host the conference as well.
Wow, just wow.
Look, okay. I look forward to going. I reckon I get some good content there.
Yeah, there is that. I think on a slightly more depressing level, what's that mean for Aussie energy and the price of the energy?
Look, this is interesting. Our Australian energy regulator, literally 3 days ago, so a couple of weeks after the election, happened to now just rubber stamp an up to 10% increase in power prices for this year alone, on the back of increased cost of transmission build out across the NEM. So, obviously with a broader asset portfolio of renewable asset generation assets, you need more transmission. Transmission in Australia has a very good track record of being over budget. And so, you're building that. The thing is, as soon as you put in the regulated asset base, you're building that in for generations. So, 10% this year, who knows what next year. But it's just, I know exactly, and I know that, they probably had these numbers before the election, but decide to finalise them and communicate them after the election. Oldest trick in the book. Well, so that's not great.
It's not great, and you got to ask the question. To what end? I think unfortunately the answer is the slightly unrealistic, in my view, net zero. I mean, here in the UK, I think there's a dawning realization that that's not going to do much for our energy prices, and quite frankly, it's an unobtainable objective. What are you Aussies going to try to do that's going to be different? Why is it going to change for you guys?
That was part of the internal friction. I mentioned that the coalition sort of splintered post-election. Liberal and National parties sort of went their separate ways. They have just kissed and made up, and they now form a coalition again as opposition. However, one of the policy questions that the Nationals, various people in the Nationals had, was whether or not Australia should be dumping its net zero commitments. You've even seen New Zealand start to walk back their net zero commitments, which, if New Zealand is doing that, and we always think of our little brothers over the Tasman as way more environmentally forward thinking than we are, it really starts to make you wonder. So that concept of dumping net zero is starting to get into the vernacular a little bit. However, you've got to be careful in Australia of being too Trumpist, if you will. And so, it's a growing but still minority view over here. I will say, though, that having what was a resounding success for Labor in the election, look, it wasn't the worst outcome, because what we thought would happen before the election was probably a minority government with the Greens. And that would have been an economic effing disaster. So having Labor at least being able to govern in the majority, at least in the lower house, I think is we actually dodged a bullet on that one.
I mean, it's kind of interesting, the politics around the world at the moment. Like we've had a new party come out of nowhere here in the UK called Reform. It's basically conservative of old, but they've jumped on the clickbait bandwagon and gone with Reform. I think in the US, I think Trump is creating a new type of politics. you guys with Labour and Liberals, hard at it like we used to be in the UK. Do you think there's going to be any change in the way that the political environment works?
I think the Liberal National Party are really looking hard at themselves. There is a splinter of them, and people are sort of along the reform lines, suggesting it's the new blue. There needs to be a reform style of coming to Jesus. And others say that the current Liberal National Party are just Labor light. They're too undifferentiated to form a true conservative opposition. So, yeah, I think it's a long road back. And that said, in Australia, we do have a history of, voting someone in quite strongly and then within 3 years kicking them out. So, that has happened in the past.
Right.
So Kevin Rudd in 2007 won a landslide victory, and yet he was gone 2.5 years later.
So what's going to change? What do you think? And will it change?
Being the energy geek and nerd, I like to think that energy policy is the driver of everyone's decision. Probably a bit out of line on that. Look, I think Australia has to have some hard moments. It's still been, life in Australia is still a privileged place to be. And, we've had issues of the UK, but only on a light level, in terms of, whether it be these issues on immigration concerns, or energy, economic doldrums, all sorts of stuff. Australia has to date avoided the worst of all that. And maybe we need to have some policy failures come through hard, and then people will wake up.
Well, it's confusing for the rest of us to watch. I have to say, from outside, so goodness knows what it's like to actually be in.
Too. Yep.
Yeah. So I think unexpected. Some lessons to be learned. People need to, I think, because we've had that as well recently. The Conservative parties have been decimated in the polls.
Yeah.
Not just the.
So one thing I will say about that, right? So unexpected, we dodged a bullet. And
Yeah.
so there was this knee-jerk reaction going, well, now that Labor is in the ascendancy in both state, in WA and federally, surely that means uranium is stuffed. Uranium mining reform is stuffed. And I'd actually call that out and say that's absolutely not the case. Having strong WA Labor now with a mandate to be pragmatic and deliver on policy that's best for the state actually is. It's better having a strong government than a weak one in this instance. So, I've been at pains to educate the market. I wrote a little article on the news just the other day saying, this is not the worry. It would have been worse if we'd had a Greens minority because, at least in Australia, at least in Europe, you've got some Greens who are pro-nuclear. In Australia, the federal Greens stated policy is to completely divorce ourselves from the radioactive value chain, which means, shutting down even existing uranium export, obviously, and not progressing nuclear energy either. So having them out of the picture of the balance of power federally is a very, very good thing. And we drive forward policy change in WA and Queensland.
Right. Well, let's get back onto the topic at hand, which is obviously energy. So the politicians have done what they do best. What else has been happening in the Aussie energy sector?
So, in the terms of energy and flowing out of elections and stuff, basically the largest emitter of carbon dioxide in the Southern Hemisphere is the Karratha gas plant as part of the DBNGP, the Dampier gas project. There was a very crucial vote to extend its life. That was due before the election, but the federal government decided to push it out past the election because they didn't want people to know how they were going to do it. They have literally yesterday voted to approve that for another 50 years. So, whilst it's a Labor government, left-leaning, supposedly pro-environment, all that kind of stuff, now the environmental groups are up in arms, given that Labor has just approved, what is the largest emitter of carbon dioxide in the Southern Hemisphere. It's a huge project, big LNG project. And so, that's important for the Australian and especially the West Australian economy. for our exports. And it's important to show that sovereign risk is manageable in Australia, because we do have people now concerned that our government is not pro-investment, and we have companies saying you're not going to invest in Australia anymore because of that. So I think it's a great demonstration that you can still do business in Australia.
But what about all of these the renewable projects, right? We talked last time out about Twiggy forests, green hydrogen, space.
A few more failures on that front.
Oh, okay, good.
Yeah, since
Tell
then,
me more.
Look, I think every one of the projects that receive federal funding to progress through, I think now every one has folded. Bit of an embarrassment, obviously, but that's one thing, is that if green hydrogen is going to happen, it's going to be further off than people think. Now, I fundamentally don't think it's going to happen, but for people to understand what that means to the grid in Australia, that's a real problem, because with our renewables heavy energy proposed grid, our regulator assumes that there's 14 gigawatts of renewable energy powered green hydrogen electrolyzers sitting there, turning on and off only when there's excess renewable energy to balance the system. If that doesn't happen, which no one thinks it will, they've got to go back and completely reconsider how they provide balance and storage and other things in the system. So, they'll have to be doing a lot more thinking when the new plan comes out sort of every year or so. They're going to have to rewrite that.
Well, they're going to have to rewrite that, but also I think the mindset of people are going to have to change somewhat, because there's been a massive push over here on household batteries, and it just is just not working. And it's not working partly because the pricing is, well, you'll recoup your outlay within 7 to 8 years, just as the battery is dying
out of warranty.
So it's like, why am I doing this then? I'm not saving any money. Maybe if I want to feel good, if that's important to me, I might do this. But then you've got this massive outlay at the beginning, when people right now, wallets are suffering from tax bills and inflation. So it's not sticking here. What about what's happening in Australia?
A couple of things. So our energy network planners assume in their plan out to 2050 that 95% of households buy a battery, and this is how they say renewables is cheaper, because there's 157, I think it is 160 gigawatt hours of storage assumed in the NEM from household batteries that the network assumes it can use. So it's coordinated. The network can drain your home battery when it wants to. Yet because it's the private sector that outlays for these batteries, it doesn't have to include it in the cost of firming for the network. So it makes firmed renewables look cheap, right? So that is one example of craziness. The second thing is, yes, this, as part of this election, the Labor government has gone forward with a policy of subsidising home batteries to the tune of about 50%. But again, they don't count the cost of the subsidy in the cost of the energy grid. So again, that's why they can say renewables cheapest. So what a lot of people were campaigning for, and honestly, not on a political basis, but campaigning for on a transparency basis, is to do a whole of system analysis of the cost of various different energy policies and put them on the table. That hasn't been done, still hasn't been done in Australia. And so, we are pushing forward with mass battery and mass rooftop solar deployment. And again, rooftop solar is another one where obviously the government subsidises it to an extraordinary degree in Australia. Yet because it's behind the meter and it's not on network infrastructure, it's on your home infrastructure, they don't cost it. So there's all these interesting tricks of the trade to demonstrate an outcome that you want. But you've got to look for batteries to make sense. You've got to get that payback down, below 5 years. And it's not there yet.
No, it just seems that the margins are being captured by industry, not the people who need ultimately pay for it. And I just don't think it works at the moment. Let's move on to uranium. So obviously we've seen a bit of price movement. People are feeling a little bit more positive. And so we will talk about executive orders in a second. What and it's got to move a lot further because again, all I hear from the uranium companies that I speak to is we need price incentive. We're not going to do anything. We're not going to move forward. Mr. Borshoff's stopped a little bit of work at his project.
Yeah, you're not going to see John getting out of bed below $100. No.
Yeah. So if that's the reality, there's the discrepancy between the incentive price, which is a moving feast. I guess inflation is part of that, but I think there's also reluctance by some to actually say, well, no, we actually got to prove we're going to get this stuff out of the ground, not just economically, but get it out technically. So how are you kind of reading this? For companies like yourselves, it's you need that price movement, need to move sentiment, all of that kind of good stuff, but it's not there yet.
So for us, we're obviously constrained by current WA government policy, which doesn't allow us to extract it. I would be at pains to say that if I was allowed to mine on the current lay of the land at the current pricing, I would be making copious amounts of money. Now that's just the nature of ISR mining, being lower capex, a competitive OPEX, and having the benefit of a world-class mining jurisdiction where just general mining capabilities and equipment is available, and it's well priced and well maintained and everything else. So for Australian uranium, I think there are the likes of Boss at Honeymoon, who obviously Olympic Dam and Beverly 4 Mile still pumping uranium out, but you're not going to see anyone new until some things change policy wise and then price wise as well. For the first time in 50 years, roughly, the World Nuclear Fuel Buyers Conference is down in Sydney next week. Deliberate to highlight the capabilities and the potential for future supply coming out of Australia. I hope that generates some media and some attention on the issue that Australia could do so much more. Yes, a bit of price would help, but more so, we just need bans lifted, most notably in Western Australia and in Queensland. And I would say one of those states, WA, is a Labor state and Queensland is a Liberal state. So, the argument on lifting bans is actually no longer political because we've got one of each. It's just common sense and practical.
Right. Bit of other news, which, and I'm going to keep saying, we're going to get to the executive order. Don't worry about it. We will. Folks.
Yeah. I want to talk about
it. There's so much more to talk about. Before then, saving the best to last, I think. Sprott, they've obviously done a little race, I think, and surprised people. What did you make of it?
Well, surprised people, but also surprised people in the manner in which they did it. A placement at a, frankly, premium to get around and instead of doing the money. So I'm not sure. There were rumours going on about that in market participants, obviously for the days before that occurred. They may have been targeting a bit more money, but they got 25 US, and I think that's fantastic in order just to get rid of that overhang of whether or not they'd sell pounds into the market, right, to fund their costs. So you can. This is the first time they've ever done that kind of placement, and that sort of demonstrates it can be done, and hopefully that means that overhang will never be there again. Sputt's getting pretty close to asset value, sort of over the last few days, although I know maybe not today. So just hope that they're going to start printing again and start hoovering up a few pounds. But generally, look, fantastic. And playing into the broader theme coming out of the US just shows that there's a lot of stuff that's primed to sort of run on the back of all this sort of macro positivity.
What do you think Sprott will do now as well? Because obviously I think people want them to kind of hoover up all this loose inventory and drive that spot price, the thing that they look at and adore. Will they? And if so, how much?
Look, assuming they can get back to NAV and actually issue, as they have done, pretty regularly over the last year and a bit. Yes, I think they can hoover up some pounds. But you've got to remember, there ain't that freaking many pounds in the spot market. So it's not as if they need to they don't need to go to town. It's just picking up the loose cargo here and there. And you may well see, if there's a risk of that happening, you may see utilities jumping in first and actually pick up some spot, and then doing carry trade if they need to, if they don't need it down the line, just out of worry, because obviously the argument being, once Sprott's got it, it ain't coming back to the market. Well, not coming back to the market at anywhere near the same price.
Oh boy, I think we sort of have been hearing that since Sprott started. There's not a lot out there, and they've hoovered up a lot very quickly. So is Yellowcake, with the Kazakhs. People are a bit bored of hearing the same lines. I think and that's the problem with this space at the moment. And the boy called Wolf scenario for the last 5 years in this space, and I think. Is this the year? I've said this every year since 2019. Is this the year? And everyone goes, yes, it is. Is it?
Yeah, there obviously needs to be a catalyst. And, one of those catalysts is actual increasing demand. So there is...
Tick. Well... You've done that. Don't you think?
Yeah, well, what I'm saying, obviously, 3 miles is going to turn on, but it's not yet on, right? Those Belgium has stopped its phase out, but that phase out was in a few other years. You've still got to get additional uranium pounds right at the front of that curve, and so there's all that positivity there. But new plants aren't yet operating, and Japan's plants are coming back, they'll be filling. They're filling, but it's slow going. We just had a webinar by Guy Keller from Tribeca. I don't know if you heard that earlier today. And, Guy was saying, uranium is the easiest commodity to model a demand profile from, because so freaking far out in advance, because things just take a long time to happen. And so, there is that needing to actually get new pounds being burned, more additional pounds being burned. Or stop closures of ones that were closed. And you take, for example, Taiwan actually shut its last reactor. There are many that would have liked to see that keep going, and may well still. Supposedly there's going to be potentially a referendum on that, but I'm not sure where that's going.
Yeah, I said this a lot over the past few months, and written about it. We've talked about it on shows, which is I'm personally not worried about the demand. I don't think we could fill current demand, yet it continues to grow. So demand it's not a demand story anymore. It's a supply story, and my nervousness around red book numbers and claims by companies and commentators is just, even if we get to $100 again soon. There's not a whole bunch of people who can get the pounds out of the ground quickly enough for 2030, and quite frankly, in a lot of cases, even for 2040. So that I want to see more action on that side of things. And I think sort of recent events we've sort of seen out of the US. Here we go, folks. We're talking about it. Executive orders. We're talking about energy dominance. 4 times the amount of nuclear energy. We shall see. But I think more importantly, down at ground level, sort of expedited approvals process. We saw that with Anfield recently.
Yeah, and look, 2 weeks. They said it'd take 2 weeks. Took less than 2 weeks. And it was approved. Now that's the federal approval. They've got a few other things to do, but as an example, and compare that to Australia, where you're facing years. That is a phenomenal outcome. But again, and when I look at with my Australian uranium hat on, that's fantastic that the US can do that, and therefore they can, essentially take US domestic production from zero, because it's currently what it is essentially, to something. What do they currently burn? 50 million pounds a year, say. I don't think they'll get to quadruple nuclear. But even if they triple nuclear, which means they double and a half probably their uranium, they still need another 75 million pounds on top of their 50 existing, where they currently produce zero. So the gap widens still, even if they start domestically producing some uranium. And historically, like a few other things like critical minerals like vanadium, the US, while it's been able to produce, hasn't economics haven't necessarily been the driving factor of their production, right? Like it was a strategic thing. We did it. They did it. They could do it at a relatively high cost, but they could do it. And I think the key for the US going forward is we'll be learning how to produce uranium at a competitive price.
Yeah.
Whereas in Australia, we can produce at a competitive price.
Yeah, I think there's a well, obviously, I'm going to sort of include the Canadians in this comment, which is not only do the Aussies need to kind of the politicians get out of their own way. I think it's a phrase we use here. But Canadians too. You know, there are big barriers, long time frames for permitting, licensing, and so forth. So you know they have the uranium. They've got great grades. They just can't get it out of the ground anytime soon. And I think there's some doubts about some of the economics of these prices that you know not looking for £100 uranium, looking for £200 $200 uranium, I should say. It's a slow process there, and in the US there's just not a lot of this stuff. It's lots of small poxy little projects, and it's like someone's got to roll those up, someone's got to get after it.
Scale in the US is an issue. Yeah,
it's a real
scale
problem.
in the US is an issue. Look, in Canada, the grades are phenomenal. You know, you're getting up to 20% uranium, so 200,000 parts per million. You know, Matt, my grade in WA might be 400 parts per million, right? Not 200,000. Yet we will be cheaper to mine because of it's an ISR project. And in Canada, it might be 20% uranium, but it's 600 meters underground in permafrost. So not the easiest thing to mine, right? So, you know, uranium is a funny one where, as opposed to, you know, grade is always king in gold and other things, uranium is very, very much dependent on your mining method and a few other things. So, I'm not necessarily dazzled by the Canadian deposits. What I am dazzled by is the fact that, you know, they do have an end-to-end nuclear value chain. They've got a great nuclear sector, you know, can-do technology. That's what Australia should have developed in the 1970s, but we decided to go down the coal path instead, unfortunately.
Isn't it a great name? Can do. Brilliant.
Can do with a can do, mate. That's great marketing.
Yeah. Well, I think that I think Denison's looking at an ISR project, and you know they're trying to make it work, you know, with their ice domes and all the rest of it. But you know, at the end of the day, they're in a basin; it's full of water. I can see why people are taking the time to work out if they should let that happen. And you know, ISR projects happening in New Mexico.
So we've got Peninsula happening in Wyoming.
Or not happening.
Well, not happening. Yeah. You've obviously got bosses 30% interest in Alta Mesa. They're sort of ramping up. So it's getting there. There are those projects. You've got a couple of others. GUE has £50 million sitting in Wyoming in conjunction JV with another group. So there are a couple of big projects, but then, you know, nothing that has yet been commercially banging. And, you know, you draw that parallel. Basically, I mean, the star on ramp up in recent terms has to be Boss Energy at Honeymoon.
For sure.
Blowing out of the water.
Yeah, we caught up with Duncan about a month ago. And yeah, it seems to be making a lot of the right moves. I think, and they're also, you know, maybe looking at maybe a bit more M&A. I think genuinely looking at some M&A. You know, everyone's got to talk.
Yeah, he's picked up a stake in Laramide, so he's got they've got the Westmoreland asset in Queensland, which is a cracking asset, really good.
Cracking, but we need to maybe. I think there'll be more. There's got to be more than that because, in fact, I can't say
watch
too
this
much.
Space. Yeah,
watch this space. I think is the phrase. Exactly right. You know, it's kind of a sort of strange time. I'm not quite sure what's going to get this sector going. I think it's going to be a bit more than price, because I think that we talk, and you know, Borshoff's talks about it since 2019. He said the biggest problem in this space is not going to be money. It's going to be the skilled people who have actually done it before or know what they're doing and not learning on the job. And I think so. The more I talk to her, I think the more I realize that's true.
You know, Borshoff. He ain't getting any younger or healthy looking, right? And that is true with many in the sector. They're getting on in years. You know, you are starting to see a bit of new talent or circulation at the top of some of the companies. Alligator Energy's announced a new CEO. So, see how long Boss stays around. And obviously Brandon has transitioned obviously into a chairman role, to really focus on ramp up there with someone who's done it before. So I think there are people there. I think
not a lot of them.
The skills will be transferred through necessity and maybe some schools of hard knocks and some interesting learnings, but we'll get there. The more the skills I worry about are not on the mining side, Matt. And we've talked about this a lot. It's building large scale reactors on a production line basis, to get costs down, because you have to get learnings out of those reactors, and that's where the skill base is freaking gone. And obviously, you guys are having a great fun time building Hinkley C at the minute.
So much fun. So much fun. And it's so cheap as well.
Hopefully, Sizewell will be a walk in the park in comparison. But you've got to get those skills.
It's always been that. It's like we reinvent the wheel every single time in a meaningful way. It can be factory production line. It could be like the Chinese, it could be like the Koreans. But no, we've got, each one's got to be unique, and it is crazy. That's why I have such great hope for these SMRs, because they're more likely to be a bit more production line in nature. So we shall see. We shall see. But sticking with the US, okay. So executive order is out. It's not just a case of the expediency here. It's not just about the saying, we're going to 4 times nuclear energy production. It's ambitious, but it just kind of shows intent. And as a leader of the free world, etc., it kind of gives permission for other politicians to maybe get behind it in the respective countries. I think Europe, it's starting to affect the way that the conversations are being had. The Germans are loosening up a bit, talking to the French about nuclear energy in a sort of meaningful way.
I think those executive orders are fantastic, but they need to be messaged in the right way. And you already in Australia and possibly in Europe, we're seeing the message in the wrong way. And that is that Trump is cutting safety in order to expedite new build. He's reducing regulation and curtailing the powers of the NRC. Now, that's one reading of it. The other one is, just because you're removing a regulation doesn't mean you're affecting safety. But if we're in an international jurisdiction where a good chunk of the population probably wants to take an adverse reading to anything Trump does, that's what we're facing. That's where we're saying things in Australia, how it gets messaged. And my point has strongly been, look, say what you will about them, divorce the man from the policy. In fact, even Biden wanted to triple nuclear, right? So Trump only quadrupling. That's not that much more. Nuclear is the strongest bipartisan supported policy of any of the policy platforms in America, right? So, people shouldn't say these are Trump's executive orders. Fuck that. These are executive orders in order to deliver energy growth in the US, which is needed for, data centers and all sorts of our future. It's too easy to put the word Trump in front of it and then say, we shouldn't be paying any attention to it. It really annoys me.
It sounds like it. Talking of being annoyed, how's your week been?
Great. So we were in trading halt on Monday. That was not the best day to be on trading halt on ASX, given that Mr. Trump did do these executive orders. So we missed a bit of a frothy day, but we're in trading halt for a capital raise. Look, it's been a tough little time at the junior end of the ASX in uranium. So this is a sort of step down raise for us. But because of that, and I know new shareholders will be very sensitive to dilution, we're just doing an entitlement issue, direct to shareholders, no broker involved, but fully underwritten for no fee by a major shareholder. So I'm paying literally no fees on the raise whatsoever. So that's, I think, a great outcome for our shareholders. Possibly a few brokers and other investors who are not participants but who wanted to go and take a cheap placement might have been a bit upset about that, but there's no placement at all. It's all an entitlement issue. We've seen some very interesting trading levels in Cauldron through that process. So lots of stock being traded, and hopefully we close that in a few weeks, and that then gives us a path to continue for the next 12 to 18 months or whatever. I don't intend on being back in market raising anytime soon, save for the fact that if uranium goes back to $100 and I want to go and drill out a huge amount more, then we'll obviously raise more money at a higher price. But we've got plenty to keep going on at the minute.
Well, okay. Look, I think the bottom line is get the money in. I think your existing shareholders will be pleased with you, but I can see why the brokers have missed out on a fee this time round.
This was a small raise. I'm not suggesting we would ever try doing that with, hey, when I change that policy in WA and I have to raise 10 times the amount of money to go and gear up things, and we'll probably raise it at 10 times the valuation. Then obviously, we've got very good relationships with brokers. I tend to be very proactive about reaching out to our investor base, but also I think I know basically every broker in Australia in the space. So we're very pleased to have good relationships with brokers, and we look forward to continuing those relationships when we next do.
Well, there's the update from Oz, as always. Straight to the point and insightful. Appreciate that. We got to do this more regularly because it kind of feels like it's, like I say, getting a bit frothy out there. There could be some nice moves. I want to see how it affects you guys. Obviously, enjoy next week without me. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to be in Quebec instead.
Yeah, I'd actually pre-reserved a ticket at the cocktail party for you, Matt. So, I have to have twice as many cocktails. That's fine.
Well, there's more for you to drink. Yeah. So there's a silver lining there. John, I see you next time. Cheers.
Yeah, cheers, mate.